In 1887 Montana, a woman had two choices: obey or disappear. Vivienne Calloway chose a third. When her father sold her like livestock to Judge Harlan Voss, a man who had already buried two wives and broken 100 more, she looked him in the eye and said no. Two words that cost her everything: her home, her name, her safety. With a $50 reward on her head and hired guns tracking her across 3 territories, Vivienne ran. But powerful men don't just chase women who refuse them, they hunt them, and they never ever forgive. Follow this story to the very end. If it moves you, hit the like button and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this tale travels. The study smelled of cigars and secrets. The kind of room where decisions were made that ruined lives, where men sat in leather chairs and called it law. Vivienne Calloway had stood in this room 100 times, but never like this. Never with her hands clasped so tightly behind her back that her knuckles had gone bloodless. Never with her heart hammering against her ribs like something desperate to escape. Her father, Edmund Calloway, sat behind his mahogany desk, the way a man sits on a throne spine, straight chin, level gray eyes moving over her, the way he moved over financial ledgers, searching for the number that didn't add up. He'd been this way her entire life, precise, cold, and entirely certain that the world existed to serve his calculations. Say it again, he said. His voice was quiet. That was always the warning, and not the volume, but the absence of it. I won't marry him. Vivienne kept her eyes level. I won't marry Judge Voss. Edmund set down his pen. The small sound was sharp in the silence, a period at the end of a sentence she hadn't finished writing yet. He folded his hands on the desk, laced his fingers together, and studied her with an expression she'd spent 23 years learning to read. It wasn't anger. Anger was too human for Edmund Calloway. What moved behind his eyes was something colder: calculation. You won't, he repeated. Not a question, a notation. No, sir. Outside, the Montana evening was drawing long shadows across the Calloway estate. 3,000 acres of prime ranch land, the finest house west of Helena, a name that opened doors from the territorial capital to Washington. The mountains beyond the window were turning purple against a darkening sky, indifferent as always to the dramas of small human ambitions. Vivienne had spent her whole life looking at those mountains and dreaming of what lay past them. Harlan Voss, her father said slowly, as though the name itself were a kind of currency, is the most powerful judge in the Montana Territory. His connections extend to the congressional level. His endorsement alone can determine elections, grant land titles, and dissolve legal challenges that would bankrupt most men. He paused. He wants you. He's buried 2 wives. Both died in childbirth. Edmund's voice didn't change. Hardly unusual. Dorothea Voss had bruises on her arms when they laid her out. Vivienne's jaw tightened. I saw her at the viewing, her neck, her wrists. She looked like she'd been... Dorothea Voss was clumsy. The words came down like a gavel. Everyone knew it. Everyone knew to say it. The slap came without warning. She hadn't seen his hand move. One moment she was standing there, defiant and furious, and the next her head had snapped sideways, and pain was radiating from her cheekbone in hot, spreading waves. She tasted copper where her teeth had caught the inside of her cheek. The room swam for a moment, then steadied. She did not cry. She had taught herself years ago not to cry in front of him. Edmund hadn't even stood up. He was still seated, still precisely arranged, as though the act of striking his daughter had required no more effort than turning a page. His eyes hadn't changed. That was somehow the worst part. You forget yourself, he said. You forget what you are. Vivienne touched her burning cheek with 2 fingers, kept her eyes on him. What am I, father? An asset. He rose then slowly, with the measured movements of a man who has never needed to hurry because everything always comes to him eventually. A valuable one when you behave, a liability when you don't. He moved around the desk with the kind of certainty that fills rooms, fills lives, leaves no space for anything else. You are 23 years old, unmarried and educated beyond what is useful for a woman in your position. You have rejected every suitable match I have arranged because you have somehow convinced yourself that you are special. He stopped in front of her, close enough that she could smell the whiskey and cedar that lived in his clothes, that particular scent she associated with fear and forced stillness. You think, he said, that because I permitted you books and allowed you opinions at dinner, you have choices. You don't. You never did. The tutors, the piano lessons, the French, all of it was one thing and one thing only: preparation. making you marriageable to the right kind of man. And Harlan Voss is the right kind of man. He's 58 years old. He is powerful. He is cruel. He is powerful, Edmund repeated, and there was something in the repetition that made the word feel like iron, like a cage door closing. He wants you specifically, not some rancher's daughter, not a merchant's get. You because you carry the Calloway name, because you're refined, because you speak well, and carry yourself with grace, because in the right drawing room, you make men believe that excellence is possible. He gripped her chin, tilted her face up, forced her to hold his gaze. He is willing to overlook your age, your headstrong nature, your regrettable tendency toward independent thought. Do you understand what a gift that is? It's not a gift. Her voice somehow did not shake. It's a sentence. His grip tightened until pain shot through her jaw, until her eyes watered against her will. You will marry Judge Voss. The contracts are already drawn. The announcement goes to the papers this week. The ceremony is set for September the 20th. I won't. You will. I won't do it. The words came out flat and final. I would rather be dead. For just a moment, just a flicker there and gone, something moved in Edmund Calloway's eyes. Not compassion. More like a man who has underestimated a variable and is revising his equation. He released her chin and stepped back. 3 days, he said. What? 3 days to come to your senses. You'll stay in your room. You will think about what your life looks like without the Calloway name, without money, without protection, without any of the things I have spent 23 years providing. He returned to his desk, sat down, picked up his pen as though she were already dismissed. You'll think about what happens to women who have nothing and no one. Vivienne stood very still, and if I don't change my mind, he didn't look up. Then you're no daughter of mine, and you're no longer welcome in this house or any house I have influence over, which in case you've forgotten includes most of western Montana. A pause. And Harlan Voss will still have you. Disgraced women are cheaper. He's always had a preference for breaking the ones with spirit. The words landed like stones dropped into deep water, slow and terrible and final. 3 days. Vivienne left the study without another word. Her room was beautiful the way a birdcage is beautiful. Rose-patterned wallpaper, lace curtains that caught the last light of evening, a 4-poster bed with silk sheets that cost more than most families earned in a year. She had lived in this room her entire life. She knew every creak of the floorboards, every draft from the window that didn't quite seal the way the moonlight came in at an angle in October that turned everything silver. She heard the key turn in the lock behind her and did not flinch. She had been locked in before. As a child, defiance meant hours in this room without supper. As a young woman, the isolation stretched into days until she learned to perform the version of herself her father found acceptable. He called it discipline. Vivienne had always known it for what it was, surgery performed without anesthetic, removing the parts of her that failed to serve his purposes. She stood at the window and watched the estate darken below her. The stable hands finished their work and disappeared. The kitchen lights went out one by one. Somewhere on the grounds, dogs were kenneled for the night. The world her father owned went through its motions without her, obedient and predictable. 72 hours. 3 days to either become what he needed her to be or to figure out an alternative. There was no alternative. That was the trap carefully constructed over 2 decades. He controlled the money, the connections, the name. She had no professional skills that translated to wages, no independent friendships beyond the social circle he curated, no family who would risk his wrath to shelter a rebellious daughter. She was, as he'd said, an asset, and assets didn't walk away from their holders. She pressed her forehead to the cool glass and let herself feel the full weight of it. Then she stopped. If she was truly alone, if she had nothing and no one, then she also had nothing left to lose. And women with nothing left to lose were the most dangerous kind. She began to think. The knock came after midnight. Vivienne had been lying in bed in the dark, mapping out scenarios with the precision of someone who has spent her whole life being taught to plan for other people's futures. She sat up instantly when she heard the familiar pattern, 3 soft taps, a pause, 1 more, and moved to the door. The lock clicked from outside. The door opened just wide enough for a slim figure to slip through, and then Clara Watts was standing in the room, her dark hair loose from its day braid, her hands doing that nervous thing they always did, twisting her apron, even though she wasn't wearing one. Clara had been with the Calloway household for 2 years. She was 19, quick-witted, and had a gift for making herself invisible that Vivienne had always suspected was survival strategy rather than shyness. Vivienne had always been kind to her, not as a strategy, just because there was no good reason not to be, and plenty of bad reasons to be otherwise. Right now, Clara looked like she'd rather be anywhere else in the world. "Miss Vivienne," she whispered, "I shouldn't be here." "No," Vivienne agreed. "But you are. What's wrong?" Clara glanced at the door at the dark window, then back at Vivienne. Her hands were shaking. "I heard things in the kitchen. The staff, they're saying things about what's going to happen." "What things?" The words came out in a rush, tumbling over each other. "That you refuse the judge, that your father intends to force the marriage anyway, and that if you won't go willing, he'll have someone." She stopped, swallowed. "Drugged, miss. Delivered like cargo. They're saying it like it's already decided." Vivienne went very still. "There's something else," Clara said. Her voice had dropped so low it was barely sound. "My cousin. She worked in Judge Voss's house, with his second wife, Mrs. Dorothea Voss." "Go on." "She left after 3 months. Wouldn't give notice, just ran. Wouldn't talk about it much. But I asked her once, directly I asked what happened in that house." Clara met Vivienne's eyes. "She said some houses have ghosts that are still breathing." The phrase hung in the dark room like smoke from an extinguished candle. Vivienne made her decision in the span of a breath. "Clara, I need your help." The maid's eyes went wide. "Miss, I can't. I'm not asking you to do anything dangerous. Just one thing." Vivienne moved to her wardrobe, her mind already 3 steps ahead, already measuring distances and risks. "Tomorrow night after the house is settled, I need the kitchen door to be unlocked. They'll know it was me. They'll dismiss me without references, and I'll never work in a decent house again." "I know." Vivienne turned open the small cedar box on her dresser and lifted out a strand of pearls, her mother's, one of the few things she'd inherited, kept secret from her father who would have sold them. They were worth 6 months of a housemaid's wages, maybe more in the right shop. "Take these. If anyone asks you, say I must have found the key myself. You knew nothing." Clara stared at the pearls as though they might bite her. "Clara," Vivienne's voice was steady, "if I stay here, I will die. Not tonight. Maybe not for years. But I will die not the way bodies die, but the way people die. Everything in me that is worth preserving will disappear, and whatever's left won't be worth saving." She pressed the pearls into Clara's hands. "Please." For a long, terrible moment, Clara said nothing. Then she closed her fingers around the pearls, gave one small, sharp nod, and slipped back out of the room. The lock clicked behind her. Vivienne stood in the darkness for a moment, then began to prepare. The next day moved with the particular cruelty of days you are waiting to escape. Breakfast arrived on a tray. Poached eggs, toast, tea. She ate everything because she was going to need her strength, and there was no virtue in suffering unnecessarily. Around noon, the door opened to admit a thin man named Whitmore, her father's attorney, carrying a leather case, and the expression of a man who has long since stopped asking whether the things he facilitates are good. "Miss Calloway," he said, not quite meeting her eyes, "your father asked me to review the marriage contract with you, so there are no misunderstandings." "I understand perfectly, Mr. Whitmore. Nevertheless," he cleared his throat and began. She let him read. "Property rights all hers would transfer to her husband upon marriage. Financial management entirely under spousal control. Inheritance, any children, would belong to the Voss family name, the Calloway line reduced to a middle name at best." Then Whitmore reached the clause that made the room go cold. "Should the wife prove difficult," he read, his voice carefully neutral, "the husband retains legal authority to seek medical remedies, including but not limited to supervised confinement for the wife's well-being and mental restoration." "Supervised confinement," Vivienne said. "You mean an asylum?" "Medical care," Whitmore said, "should it become necessary, for the crime of having opinions." He gathered his papers. "Your father expects an answer by tomorrow evening, Miss Calloway." "He'll have one." She held the door open for him. "Just not the one he wants." After Whitmore left, she prepared. She couldn't take much. Too much missing would raise an alarm before she had enough distance between herself and the house. She moved with quiet precision, choosing and discarding, thinking through every decision like a chess problem. Her most practical dress, dark blue wool, sturdy and plain enough to pass unnoticed. A spare change of undergarments. Her mother's small silver hairbrush worth something if she needed to sell it light enough to carry. The small folding knife she'd taken from the kitchen at 15 and never returned, kept in a hidden pocket she'd sewn into her riding skirt 2 years ago, when she'd first begun to understand what her life was building toward. No money. That was the problem that kept surfacing. Her father controlled every cent. Everything was charged to the household accounts, the Calloway name. But she had jewelry, not much but enough. A garnet bracelet, pearl earrings, a gold locket with a broken clasp that she'd never had repaired. She wrapped everything in a dark shawl, knotted it tight, and hid the bundle under her bed. Then she waited for nightfall. The house settled with its usual sounds, the grandfather clock in the hall, marking the hours, the creak of old wood contracting in the cooling air, the distant sounds of the stable hands finishing their evening work. Her father's study light went dark at 11. By midnight, the house was still. Vivienne moved. She knew which floorboards creaked and which held silent. She had learned this as a child, sneaking down to the kitchen for leftover cake, and she used that knowledge now, ghosting through her own home like a trespasser in someone else's life. The stairs were the worst. She took them one at a time, testing each step before committing her weight, her breath held in her throat. The kitchen was dark and smelled of bread and banked ashes. She crossed to the back door, gripped the handle, turned it. It opened. Clara had kept her word. The night air hit her like cold water, sharp and real, and full of the particular vastness that Montana nights carry, that sense of sky too big for any single human trouble. Vivienne stepped out, closed the door behind her with both hands, and allowed herself exactly one breath to look back at the house. The windows were dark. The mountains rose black against the star-scattered sky. The estate stretched away in all directions, all of it belonging to a man who believed he owned everything within it. She turned her back on it and walked away. The stable was familiar ground, and the horse she wanted was a chestnut mare named Clover, calm-tempered, sure-footed, with enough speed when asked, in the sense not to spook at shadows. Vivienne whispered to her the whole time she was saddling up the quiet nonsense words that horses find comforting, and Clover stood patient and still, as though she understood the gravity of the moment. Taking a horse made her a thief. The law would say so, and the law was one of the many things her father owned. But leaving without one made her helpless, and helpless women in 1887 didn't last long. She led Clover out through the side gate and didn't mount until she was well away from the house, until the gravel of the drive had given way to grass and the stable was just a dark shape behind her. Then she climbed into the saddle, settled herself, and clicked her tongue. Clover moved out at a quiet trot that lengthened as the house disappeared behind them into something that felt almost like flight. The Montana night was vast, and indifferent stars scattered overhead like spilled salt coyotes singing somewhere in the dark distance. Vivienne rode with her spine straight and her hands steady and her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her teeth. By dawn, she was 20 miles gone. The first town was called Prospect, a name that felt like a small joke given the circumstances. It was barely a town at all, a main street with a general store, a saloon, a church, and a scattering of houses that looked like they'd been placed without particular intention and never moved since. Vivienne rode in slowly, aware of eyes. A woman traveling alone attracted attention in the same way that a crack in a wall attracts water naturally, inevitably, and in ways that rarely end well. She dismounted outside the general store and went in. The man behind the counter was thin and weathered and suspicious in the way that men become when they've seen enough trouble to know it usually arrives wearing a reasonable face. "Help you, miss. I need supplies." Vivienne kept her voice steady and her eyes direct. "Bread if you have it, dried meat, anything that travels well. That'll be cash money. I have jewelry." His eyes narrowed. She produced the garnet bracelet without flinching, held it out for inspection. He turned it over in the window light, examining the setting, the stones. "Where'd you get this?" "It was my mother's." "And where's your mother?" "Dead, sir." He looked at her for a long moment with the particular assessment of a man who is weighing his own risks. Then he set the bracelet down and began gathering supplies. "This'll cover food and a little extra," he said without looking up. "But if someone comes looking, I didn't see you." "No one will come looking," she said. She knew it was a lie even as she said it. She made it 2 more towns before the money ran thin, and 3 before she heard the first whisper. She was in a boarding house in a nothing town called Granger when she overheard 2 men at breakfast talking too loud in the way that men do when they think no one worth worrying about is listening. She sat very still over her coffee, which was growing cold in her hands, and she heard the shape of her own disaster laid out in plain language. "Harper girl," said one of the men, and Vivienne's stomach dropped, but no. They were saying Calloway girl, and for a moment she thought she'd misheard, but then they said it again. Calloway girl, from up near Whitmore, reward posted. "How much?" $50, maybe more. "Hell," the other man said. "I'd turn in my own sister for $50. They laughed. Vivienne set down her coffee cup without a sound, rose from the table, as though she had somewhere perfectly reasonable to be, and walked out into the cold morning. She kept walking for 2 blocks before she allowed herself to lean against the wall of an alley and breathe. 50 con. Her father had posted $50 for her return. She had no illusions about what that meant. Every town between here and wherever she was going had men who would spend a week looking for $50. Every sheriff's office had her description on a notice by now. She was currency, just as her father had always said. She sold clover that afternoon. She hated herself for it. The mare had done nothing wrong and deserved better than being sold to a stranger in a dirty little livery yard. But sentiment was a luxury she couldn't carry anymore, and she needed the money more than the company. The liveryman counted out bills without questions and led Clover away, and Vivienne watched them go and felt something crack inside her chest. Not large, not dramatic, just the sound of one more thing that had been good in her world becoming a thing of the past. She had $40 and no horse, and men were looking for her. She walked west. Wyoming was different from Montana. Flatter, harsher, less willing to pretend that the landscape offered any comfort to the human beings crossing it. The towns were farther apart, the people more suspicious of strangers, and the unspoken rules about women traveling alone were enforced with the particular cruelty of communities that have survived by maintaining rigid categories. Vivienne learned to be a widow. It was the safest fiction she could construct on short notice. Black dress, downcast eyes, the universal grammar of recent loss that made people want to ask fewer questions. It didn't always work. In a town called Crossroads, a sheriff stopped her on the sidewalk with the slow, deliberate authority of a man who has been looking for exactly this kind of encounter. He was older, with a tobacco-stained mustache and eyes that moved over everything twice before settling. He blocked her path without appearing to mean to, which was its own kind of skill. "Afternoon, miss." He tipped his hat. "You got people here?" "No, sir, just passing through." "Passing through to where?" "West." "West is big territory. You got a destination?" "Not yet." He studied her with the slow, thorough attention of a man who is matching what he sees against something he's been told to look for. "You look familiar." "I don't believe we've met." "No." He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. "But there's a notice up at my office. Missing woman from the Calloway family up out of Helena. Brown hair, green eyes, traveling alone, about 23. He looked at the paper, then at her. "You know anything about that?" Vivienne's heart had gone very still. "No, sir." "Funny." He stepped closer. "You got the same coloring, same build. I imagine lots of women do. Not lots of them traveling alone with no destination." He tucked the paper away. "I think you should come with me while we sort this out. Just a conversation. Won't take long." She ran. She was already moving before he finished the sentence. Skirts hiked boots, hitting the packed dirt in a rhythm that was nothing like ladylike and everything like survival. He shouted behind her. She ducked between buildings, found an alley, found another, found the edge of town, and kept going. The sound of him fell behind her. She ran until dark. When she finally stopped, collapsed against the side of an abandoned barn in the middle of nowhere, lungs burning, legs shaking, she let herself feel the full weight of how bad this was. They were getting smarter, getting closer. She'd been on the run for weeks and she was running out of road. She couldn't last much longer. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she stood up and walked on because there was nothing else to do. The ranch appeared 3 days later, like something out of a fever dream, or perhaps a test of whether she'd given up yet. Vivienne had been walking for hours through the Wyoming scrubland, her water bottle empty, her feet blistered in boots that had never been intended for this kind of work, the sun beating down with the particular mercilessness of October light that is bright but gives no warmth. When she crested a small rise and saw buildings in the distance, a main house, a barn, outbuildings, smoke from a chimney, horses moving in a corral, she stopped and stood very still for a moment, checking whether this was real. It was. She walked toward it with what dignity she had left, which was not much. A man was working near the barn, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the kind of efficiency that comes from years of knowing exactly what needs to be done and doing it without wasted motion. He looked up as she approached, and she watched his hand drift casual, unhurried toward a rifle leaning against the barn wall. She stopped at a respectful distance, made sure her hands were visible. "I need work," she said, because there was no point in anything else. He looked at her for a long moment, not with hostility exactly, more with the careful attention of a man who has learned to assess risks quickly. His eyes were dark and still. "Where'd you come from?" "East." "East is specific. East of here is specific enough." A pause. "You running from something?" "I'm running towards something." She held his gaze. Work, a future, whatever that looks like. That a problem? She said nothing. He looked at her hands. He looked at her dress, the dark blue wool that had started as practical and was now just worn. He looked at her face, which she kept as still as she could, which was becoming harder. What's your name? Vivienne. She hesitated only a fraction. Vivienne Marsh. You got references? Family money? No. So you got nothing but the clothes on your back and a story I'm guessing isn't true. She met his eyes directly. That about sums it up. He was quiet for another moment, the kind of quiet that weighs things. My name is Rafe Decker, he said finally. This is my ranch. I run cattle, some horses. It's just me working it, which is why I could use help. He paused. I don't tolerate lies and I don't shelter criminals. You understand that? I'm not a criminal. You are lying. I'm surviving, she said. Is that a crime? Something shifted in his expression. Not quite sympathy, more like a man recognizing the shape of something he's seen before in a mirror or a memory. Bunkhouse is around back, he said. Food at sunup and sundown. Work starts at dawn. He turned back to the barn. We'll talk wages when I see what you're worth. It wasn't generous. It was something. Thank you, Mr. Decker, she said. Don't thank me yet. He disappeared into the barn. Vivienne walked to the bunkhouse on legs that were nearly done and sat on the narrow bed for a long moment without moving. Through the small window, she could see him working in the fading light, unhurried, competent, a man built for exactly the life he was living. He knew she was lying. He'd said so plainly. He'd given her shelter anyway. She lay down on the narrow mattress and tried not to think about the reward notice pinned to sheriff's office walls in 3 territories. Tried not to think about the hunters she knew were coming. Outside, the Wyoming evening settled over the land like something vast and patient, and somewhere in it, men with money and instructions were moving steadily toward her. She closed her eyes and let exhaustion take her. For the first time in weeks, she slept. Dawn came with the sound of a bell and the smell of cold air, and for one disoriented moment, Vivienne didn't know where she was. Then the narrow mattress registered in the unfamiliar ceiling, and the distant sound of horses and memory flooded back, with the particular efficiency of problems that don't sleep. She dressed in the semi-dark, winced at her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand, her hair coming loose, shadows under her eyes, a smear of road dust on her cheekbone that she'd apparently missed the night before, and made her way across the yard to the main house. Rafe Decker was already in the kitchen when she arrived. He looked up from the coffee he was pouring, took in her appearance with one sweeping glance that didn't linger, and nodded toward the stove. You said you could cook. I can. Eggs in the basket by the door. Bacon's in the cold box. Bread's stale, but it'll toast. He set down his cup. Back in 20 minutes. He walked out before she could respond. Vivienne stood alone in the unfamiliar kitchen, her hands not quite steady as she reached for the egg basket. She had cooked before, but always under the supervision of the Calloway family's cook, always within a system where failure had consequences, but someone else would fix them. Here there was no safety net. Just a stranger's kitchen, a stranger's expectations, and the knowledge that her continued presence on this ranch depended entirely on proving she was worth the trouble. She got to work. By the time Rafe returned, she'd managed scrambled eggs that were soft rather than rubbery bacon that was crisp on the edges without being burned, and toast that was only slightly darker than ideal on one side. She'd also found coffee, already ground and brewed a fresh pot. He sat down, ate methodically, drained his coffee, and refilled it before he spoke. Not bad. Thank you. Can you men handle a washboard? I can learn. He stood, carried his plate to the basin. Today you start with the chickens. Feed them, collect eggs, clean the coop. After that laundry, then we'll see. He paused at the door. Out here, everything breaks. You need to know how to put it back together. He left. Vivienne put it back together, one humiliation at a time. The chickens were nothing short of demonic. They attacked her hands when she reached into the nesting boxes, scattered feed in directions that defied physics and produced more waste than seemed possible for creatures of their size. By the time she'd finished cleaning the coop, her dress was ruined, her arms were scratched, and she had developed a profound and personal animosity toward poultry as a species. The laundry was worse. The washboard scraped her knuckles until they bled. The lye soap burned. Her back ached from bending over the basin in a way that she had never experienced before. For not a dramatic pain, but a slow grinding insistence that this was not what her body had been built for. The Wyoming wind kept depositing fresh dust on sheets she'd just wrung out and hung. When Rafe returned that evening, she was sitting on the bunkhouse steps. Her hands were bleeding, her muscles had given up organizing themselves, and she was too tired to move. He looked at her hands without comment, disappeared into the barn, came back with a tin of salve and held it out. She took it, opened it, began working it into her knuckles. He sat down on the step below hers, not close, not distant, a neutral space. "You'll toughen up," he said. "Is that supposed to be encouraging?" "It's supposed to be true." He pulled out a cigarette, lit it with practiced ease, let the smoke drift toward the dimming sky. "You made it through day one. Most don't." "Most what?" "People who show up here the way you did." He took a long drag. "With nothing, nowhere else to go. They usually quit by noon." "I'm not most people." "I'm starting to see that." He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the darkening ranch. "Morrison, or whatever your real name is?" Her pulse jumped. She kept her hands moving, working the salve, and kept her expression neutral. "You're educated," he continued. "I can hear it in the way you speak. And those hands, they weren't made for this kind of work. Not until today, anyway." He took another drag. "Does it matter?" "Depends on what you're hiding from." "What makes you think I'm hiding?" "Because I know what running looks like." He ground the cigarette out under his boot. "I also know when to mind my own business. So here's the arrangement. You work hard, keep your head down, don't bring trouble to my door. We don't have problems. And if trouble finds you anyway, we'll deal with it when it comes." He stood. "Get some sleep. Tomorrow's going to be worse." He walked away before she could ask what he meant. He was right, it was worse. The second day began before dawn, with mucking stalls, a task that Vivienne would later describe in the privacy of her own thoughts as the single most physically and spiritually humbling experience of her life. After that came hauling water from the well, which involved a weight and distance equation that her body protested at every calculation. Then splitting kindling, which she'd never done before, and learning to milk a cow named Marigold, who kicked her twice before she found the proper rhythm. By the end of the first week, Vivienne's soft hands had blistered, bled, and begun tentatively, painfully to callous. Her muscles ached in arrangements she hadn't known were possible. She fell into the narrow bunkhouse bed each night with a completeness of exhaustion that left no room for fear for planning for anything except the simple animal act of sleep. She was still free, still hidden, still alive. Rafe watched her through all of it, not with suspicion exactly, more with the careful attention of a man who was revising an initial assessment. He didn't praise her, which she found she preferred to false encouragement. He corrected when she did something wrong and moved on. He was a man of very few words, and Vivienne found herself studying the silences between them, the way you study the negative space in a painting, trying to understand what the shape of the absence reveals about the shape of the presence. He lived alone. That was obvious from every surface of the ranch. The single coffee cup, the absence of a second chair at the kitchen table before she'd added one, the way the house had the feel of a place organized entirely around one person's rhythms. He worked from before dawn until after dark, with an efficiency that suggested a man who had decided long ago that work was the only thing that didn't disappoint. But he was kind, not in obvious ways, not in ways he'd admit to. Kind in small, deniable gestures, making sure there was extra food at dinner when he noticed she was losing weight. Leaving a pair of leather work gloves outside her bunkhouse door without comment when he saw the state of her hands. Teaching her how to handle the axe without jarring her wrists, demonstrating once with precise silence, and then walking away and letting her practice without hovering. It confused her. Men in her experience operated on a simple principle. They gave you something because they wanted something back, and the debt was always called in at the worst possible moment. Rafe Decker seemed to want nothing except her labor. He maintained a careful distance that she recognized as both deliberate and respectful, and she didn't know what to do with that. "Why did you let me stay?" she asked one evening. They were on the porch after supper, the sky bruising purple and gold, the air finally cooling into something bearable. Rafe was whittling something from a piece of wood, she still didn't know what, and he didn't look up from the blade. "Needed help. You could have hired a man, someone stronger." "Could have. Why didn't you?" He was quiet long enough that she thought he'd decided not to answer. Then, "You reminded me of someone who needed a chance and didn't get one." She waited. The whittling continued. "That's all," he said. The door in his voice had closed. They sat in silence while the stars came out one by one, as though the sky were slowly remembering something it had been trying to forget. 3 weeks passed, then 4. The rhythm of the ranch became Vivienne's own rhythm. She stopped having to think about it and just moved through it the way you stop having to think about breathing. She knew when to feed the animals, how to read the weather, in the color of the western sky, which sections of fence needed attention before they became problems. She knew that Rafe took his coffee, black and strong, that he had a scar on his left shoulder. He never explained that sometimes he stood at the far edge of the property in the evenings and stared west with an expression she couldn't name. She learned to be Vivienne Marsh, to answer to it without hesitation, to build the small architecture of a fiction, a dead husband, no family to speak of, a vague trajectory toward relatives in California she'd never reach. She buried Vivienne Calloway the way you bury things you intend to come back for, carefully marking the spot in your mind, telling yourself it's temporary. But late at night in the narrow bunkhouse, she thought about her father, about the $50 notice she knew was still making its way through sheriff's offices and general stores and boarding house common rooms, about Judge Harlan Voss and the shape of what awaited her if she was found. And she thought about Rafe, the strange guarded man who had given her shelter without asking for anything in return, who watched her with eyes that saw too much and said too little. She knew it couldn't last. Good hiding never did. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday. Vivienne was in the kitchen garden fighting with weeds when she heard hoofbeats. Not one horse, multiple. Moving at a purposeful pace from the direction of the main road. She froze. Rafe had ridden out before dawn to check the north fence line. He wasn't due back until afternoon. This was someone else. She stood slowly brushing dirt from her skirt and moved to the kitchen window. Through the glass, she could see a rider on a gray horse approaching at a steady pace. As he got closer, the badge on his chest caught the afternoon light. A sheriff. Vivienne's mind ran through her options in the space of a breath. Run and look guilty. Hide and maybe be found. Answer the door and lie convincingly enough to make him leave. She went to the door. The sheriff was older, maybe 60, with the weathered patience of a man who'd been doing this for a long time. He looked hot and not particularly interested in being here, which she decided to read as an advantage. Afternoon, she said, keeping the door to a width that seemed cooperative without being welcoming. Help you. Sheriff Tom Briggs, he touched his hat. Looking for Rafe Decker. He around. He's out on the property. Won't be back until this afternoon. Is there something I can help you with? His eyes moved over her with the particular professional attention that sheriffs develop. Didn't know Rafe had help. He does now. How long you been here? A few weeks. Where you from? East. She kept her answers short, her posture open, her expression blandly cooperative. Don't give him anything to pull on. Don't act like a woman with something to hide, because women with something to hide look nervous, and nervous looks like guilty. Sheriff Briggs pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket. Got some notices I'm supposed to distribute. Missing persons wanted, men drivers and ranch hands passing through, sometimes see things. You mind if I put one up in the barn? Of course not. He studied her for another moment, and Vivienne felt his gaze cataloging her. The worn dress, the work-roughened hands, the careful distance between her face and any particular expression. What's your name, Miss? Vivienne Marsh. You got family, Miss Marsh? Not anymore. Uh-huh. A pause that lasted too long. You look familiar. You've been through Crossroads Town, about 2 days east of here. The town where she'd run from the other sheriff. Never heard of it, she said. Small place? Sheriff there sent word about a woman traveling alone. Said she ran when he tried to question her. He looked at her. Lots of women travel alone. Doesn't make them criminals. Doesn't make them honest either. He seemed to shake something off. I'll just put this up and be on my way. You tell Rafe I stopped. I will. She watched him walk to the barn, her pulse hammering steadily in her ears. She couldn't see what he was posting. She already knew what it would say. She waited until he'd ridden out of sight. Then she walked to the barn on shaking legs. The notice was tacked to the main post where anyone entering would see it. It was printed neatly with a precision that spoke of professional effort. Not a handwritten description scrawled in haste, but a proper document, the kind that her father's attorneys would have supervised. Missing, Vivienne Calloway. 23 years, brown hair, green eyes, last seen leaving the family estate near Helena, Montana territory. Family greatly concerned for her welfare and safety. $50 reward for information leading to her safe return. Beloved daughter, the notice said, worried family. Nothing about forced marriage. Nothing about Judge Voss. Just the carefully constructed language of concern designed to make her return look like rescue. She should tear it down. That would raise questions. She should run. She had nowhere to go. She heard hoofbeats and spun, but it was Rafe returning early. His horse lathered and his face already tight in the way it got when he'd seen something that needed dealing with. He dismounted, looked at the notice without touching it, read it twice, and then looked at her. Vivienne Calloway, he said quietly. She waited for the next part, the part where he told her to leave or worse, told her he was sorry, but he needed that $50. That's not me, she said. Isn't it? They stood in the dim barn dust motes drifting through shafts of late afternoon light, and Vivienne felt the last of her constructed fiction crumble like old plaster. How long have you known? She asked. Since the day you showed up. He turned to face her fully. Woman alone, no money, no references, lying about her name. Then the notices started appearing in town. Wasn't hard to put together. He looked at her steadily. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you turn me in? $50 is good money. $50 isn't worth betraying someone who's running for their life. Something moved in his eyes, not anger, not accusation. Something older. You want to tell me the truth now? Vivienne's throat tightened. She told him, all of it, her father, the arranged marriage, Judge Voss's history, the ultimatum, the 3 days Clara in the unlocked kitchen door, and the horse she'd stolen, and hated herself for stealing. She told him about the sheriff in Crossroads, and the men whose conversation she'd overheard in the boarding house in Granger. She told him about selling clover and what that had felt like and how she had kept walking anyway. Rafe listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Harlan Voss, he said finally. You know him? I know of him. He came through this territory a few years ago, presiding over a land dispute. His voice went flat. The defendant was a homesteader accused of killing a rancher's son. Self-defense open and shut, the rancher's son had been terrorizing small farms for months, everyone knew it. But Voss ruled for the rancher, had the homesteader hanged. He paused. The man had a wife and 3 children. After he died, they lost the farm. The wife didn't last through the winter. Vivienne felt sick. I'm sorry, she said. Don't be sorry. Be careful. Rafe took the notice down, crumpled it in one hand. Because if Voss wants you found, he won't stop looking. And men like that, they have reach. I know. Do you? He stepped closer. Not in a threatening way, but with a directness that demanded she hear what he was saying. Because running to a ranch in the middle of Wyoming was smart. But it's not permanent. Eventually someone will recognize you, someone will talk, and when they do, I'll run again, to where you have no money, no horse. Winter's coming. He held her eyes. You won't last a week out there alone. Then what do you suggest? He was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Vivienne thought he was going to say he couldn't help. Long enough that she began preparing internally for the next impossible step. I suggest, he said finally, that you stay, work, keep your head down, and we figure out the rest as it comes. Why would you do that? Because I've seen what men like your father and Voss do to people, he said, and I am very tired of watching them win. He held her gaze. But I meant what I said about lies. You want my help, I need your trust. Real trust. No more half-truths. I could ask you the same thing, she said. You're out here alone, no family mentioned, no hands, no past you'll talk about. Seems to me like trust runs both ways. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite surprise, more like a man who'd been expecting an argument and found himself facing a mirror instead. Fair enough, he said quietly, but not today. Today let's just focus on getting through it. He walked out of the barn and Vivienne stood for a moment in the slant light, holding the weight of what she'd just traded one set of secrets for another and wondering whether she'd made things better or simply exchanged one kind of dangerous for another. The days that followed moved under a low sky. October deepened. The nights turned sharp, and an uneasy routine settled over the ranch work in the mornings, shared silences over meals. The careful choreography of 2 people who had acknowledged the limits of honesty without yet reaching through them. Rafe barely spoke. When he did, it was instructions, observations, the practical currency of shared labor. Vivienne tried to focus on the work, but she was aware of his watching, not surveillance, but something more complex, a man calibrating, recalibrating, trying to resolve some internal equation that kept refusing to balance. One evening, sitting on the porch after supper, she couldn't stand it anymore. If you're going to turn me in, she said, just do it. He looked up from the harness he was mending. If I was going to turn you in, you'd already be gone. Then what are you thinking about? Ways to keep you hidden. He set down the harness, such as keeping you away from town entirely. No trips to the general store, no contact with anyone who might have seen that notice. I can't stay locked on this ranch forever. You can until we figure out something better. And what would that be? He didn't answer. And whatever he was working through in his head, he didn't share it. Vivienne was left to wonder what it meant that she had told him everything and he had given her almost nothing in return, and yet she felt against all reasonable judgment that she could trust him. She didn't know why, she only knew that she did. 3 weeks after the sheriff's visit, a rider came after dark. Vivienne heard the hoofbeats from the bunkhouse and was already moving before they stopped. Rafe had told her what to do if anyone approached after dark, and she'd practiced the route to the root cellar until she could do it in full darkness, which she now did, easing the wooden door shut behind her and crouching in the smell of potatoes and cold earth. She heard muffled voices above. They lasted perhaps 10 minutes. Then the sound of a single horse departing, and then footsteps on the floorboards overhead, and then Rafe's voice at the root cellar door. Clear. She climbed out. His face was grim in the lamplight. That was Pete Dawson, runs a ranch about 15 miles south. He said there have been strangers in the area, well-dressed men asking questions, showing money around, looking for a woman matching your description. He paused. He said they're working their way north. Vivienne felt the walls of her options closing in. How long do I have? Days, maybe. Could be less if they move fast. Then I should leave and go where they're watching the roads, the town, probably the rail station in Cheyenne. He shook his head. Running now would be walking into them. Then I'm trapped. Not necessarily. He was pacing, and she watched him work through it. Whatever it was, she could see the calculation in his movements, the way he stopped and started and stopped again. There's one way to make you harder to find, one way that changes the legal picture entirely. He stopped pacing. Marriage, he said. Vivienne stared at him. If you're married, he said, his voice careful and even, you are no longer Vivienne Calloway. You're someone else, legally on paper recognized by the territory of Wyoming. A married woman has her husband's name. She has legal standing. She can't be taken back to her father against her will without a process that would take months and draw exactly the kind of attention your father wants to avoid. He looked at her steadily. Your father wants you married to Voss. Fine, if you're already married to someone else, that plan is dead before it starts. You're suggesting I'm suggesting a legal arrangement. Paper only. We go to the next county, find a justice of the peace, make it official. You get a new name and legal protection. I get help running this ranch. Everyone benefits. Vivienne's mind was running fast, testing the edges of the idea, looking for the catch. Except you'd be binding yourself to a fugitive. I'd be helping someone who needs it. Why? Because it's the right thing to do. He met her eyes with the directness that she had come to understand was his version of sincerity, not performed, not managed, just plain. And because I meant what I said, I'm tired of men like your father winning. Vivienne looked at him for a long moment. What would you want in return, she asked. Nothing you're not willing to give. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have. She thought about it, turned it over, examined it from every angle. A chosen trap versus a forced one. A stranger who had shown her repeatedly, quietly, without announcement, that his word was good versus a monster who had shown the world nothing but the fiction he needed them to believe. If we do this, she said finally, I need to know it's legally binding, something my father's lawyers can't easily undo. It will be, and I need to know that you won't, she stopped, searched for the precise words, that you won't expect anything beyond what we're agreeing to right now. You'll have your own space, your own life. This is protection, not ownership. His voice was steady. Anytime you want out, you say so. I won't stop you. She looked at him, looked for the lie in it, the angle she was missing. Found nothing she could name. All right, she said, let's do it. He nodded once, sharp and final. We leave tomorrow. And just like that, Vivienne Calloway agreed to marry a stranger to escape becoming someone else's property. She told herself it was survival. She told herself it was rational. She told herself it would work. She sat in the bunkhouse afterward in the dark, with her hands shaking slightly, and her heart doing something she couldn't quite categorize, and she thought about what it meant to trade one impossible thing for another. Outside, the Wyoming night closed around the ranch, vast and patient, and somewhere out in it, well-dressed men with money and instructions were moving north. They left before sunrise, riding double on Rafe's horse because it was faster and less conspicuous than taking the wagon. Vivienne sat behind him, her arms around his waist, feeling the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them and trying not to think too hard about what they were riding toward. The morning air was brutal bone cold, their breath visible in small clouds that disappeared almost instantly into the dark. Frost crunched under the horse's hooves. The Wyoming landscape was silver and black and vast, and the silence between them had a particular quality weighted with things that hadn't yet been said and might not need to be. She had packed everything she owned, which didn't take long. It all fit in the canvas saddlebag behind her. Rafe hadn't spoken since they'd saddled up. His silence felt different this morning, not the usual careful distance he maintained, but something else, something waiting. The sun was climbing by the time they reached the county line, and Rafe pulled the horse to a stop near a creek to let it drink. He dismounted first, then helped her down, hands on her waist, efficient and impersonal, the way you help someone out of a carriage. And they stood on the bank while the horse drank, and Rafe studied the horizon with narrowed eyes. "How much further?" Vivienne asked. 2 or 3 hours. Town called Millhaven. Justice of the peace there doesn't ask many questions." He paused. "I've heard." "From whom?" He looked at her sideways. "People who needed the same kind of help." She didn't press it. She was learning the shape of his silences, which ones were closed and which were just slow in opening. They rode on. The landscape shifted from flat scrub land to rolling hills, the occasional stand of juniper and pine. They passed homesteads where smoke was rising from breakfast fires, and Rafe steered them wide, of each keeping to the edges of visibility. Once riders appeared on a distant ridge, and he pulled them behind a stand of trees without a word, waiting until the riders passed. "Friends of yours?" Vivienne asked. "Don't have many of those out here." They arrived in Millhaven at midday. It was the kind of town that existed because the land required it: a general store, a livery, a saloon, a church that looked like it needed more faith than the congregation was currently providing, and a scattering of houses in various states of permanence. The main street was quiet, which Vivienne read as either lucky or unlucky, depending on what happened next. The Justice of the Peace occupied a small office with a hand-painted sign above the door, "Justice of the Peace in Calloway presiding." The coincidence of the name hit her like cold water, but she kept her expression still. Rafe tied the horse and turned to help her down. For a moment, they stood facing each other in the thin autumn light, the office door behind him. "Ready?" he said. "No." "Good." A pause. "Neither am I." They went inside. The office smelled of old paper and tobacco, with an undertone of wood polish that suggested someone had recently made an effort. A man behind the desk looked up, 60s deeply lined face, reading glasses perched on his nose, the look of a man who had seen every variation of human desperation that passed through small-town Wyoming and had made his peace with most of it. He looked at them for a moment with the practiced assessment of his profession. "Help you folks. We need to get married," Rafe said. "Today." The justice set down his pen. "That's so." He stood, moving to a filing cabinet with the unhurried efficiency of a man who does this regularly. "I'll need some information. Names, ages, any previous marriages." He looked at Vivienne. She stepped forward. "Vivienne Marsh," she said. The name she'd been living under for weeks came out smoothly, each syllable a small act of self-invention. 23, never married." The justice wrote it down. "And you, son?" "Rafe Decker," he said. 32, no previous marriages." "You two have witnesses?" "No." "Need at least one. Legal requirement." He moved toward the back door. "My clerk's around back. I'll fetch her." He disappeared. Vivienne and Rafe stood alone in the office, the scratch of the justice's pen still hanging in the air. The room was very quiet. "You can still walk away," Rafe said. His voice was low. "So can you." He didn't move. "I'm not the one running," she said. "Aren't you?" He looked at her with the same still attention he gave to the horizon every evening. "This ranch in the middle of nowhere, no family, no friends, no past you'll discuss. Seems to me like we're both running, just from different things." His jaw worked. He didn't argue. Because he couldn't, she realized. Because she was right. The justice returned with his clerk, a woman in her 40s wearing a sensible brown dress and the expression of someone who had absolutely no patience for ceremony of any kind. She positioned herself near the desk, crossed her arms, and nodded at them. "Let's get this done," she said. "I've got a pot on the stove." The ceremony took less than 5 minutes. The justice read from a well-worn book in a voice that was neither unkind nor particularly invested, and asked the necessary questions. "Do you take this woman?" Rafe's yes was immediate and firm. "Do you take this man?" Vivienne's yes was barely audible, but it was there. The justice produced a document, had the clerk witness it, stamped it with a sound like a gavel falling. $5, he said. Rafe paid. The justice handed over the certificate, the ink still damp. "Congratulations," he said. "Try to make it last." They walked back outside into the cold afternoon, and Vivienne felt disconnected from herself in a way she couldn't quite explain, as though she were watching from a slight distance as someone else moved through these moments with her face. "Mrs. Decker," Rafe said, testing the shape of it. "Don't." She folded the certificate, carefully tucked it inside her coat against her chest. "Not yet. It's your name now." "I know." She looked at him. It just hasn't settled. Give it time. They walked to the horse, and before they could mount, a man stepped out of the saloon across the street. Well-dressed for Millhaven, too well-dressed. A city coat polished boots, eyes that moved over the street in professional sweeps. He was perhaps 40, with a clean-shaven face and the particular stillness of a man who had been trained to notice things. His eyes landed on them. "Excuse me." He crossed the street at a comfortable pace. "You folks local?" Rafe's hand moved a small unconscious shift toward the rifle on his saddle. "Passing through. I'm looking for someone." The man pulled a paper from his coat, the same notice that had been posted in the barn, or one very like it. Vivienne recognized the format without needing to read it. "Young woman, brown hair, green eyes, about 23. You see anyone matching that?" Rafe looked at the paper, looked at the man. "Can't say I have." The man's eyes moved to Vivienne. She was right there, her hair, her eyes, her age, all of it, matching the description in perfect detail. But she had been in Wyoming for weeks. Her face was different in ways that weeks of hard labor and sun and cold make you different. And she was standing next to a man who was looking at this stranger with the flat, contained patience of someone who will not be trifled with. "You look familiar, miss," the man said. "I've got that kind of face." Her voice came out steady. "Have we met somewhere?" "I don't think so." The man looked between them, and Vivienne watched him calculating, weighing. Then his gaze dropped to their hands, bear no rings, and something shifted in his expression. "What brings you to Millhaven?" "Just got married," Rafe said. His voice was flat and carried a warning in it, the way certain stones carry heat. "Looking to get back to our ranch before dark." "Married." The man glanced at the justice of the peace's office at the sign above the door. "Convenient timing. Most people find marriage inconvenient. We're trying something different." Rafe gathered the reins. "If you'll excuse us." He turned the horse before the man could ask anything else, and they rode out of Millhaven at a pace just below urgent, and Vivienne did not breathe easily until the town was 2 miles behind them, and the land had opened up around them in every direction. "He didn't believe us," she said. "No, he's going to check with the justice." "He is." Rafe urged the horse a little faster. "And when he does, he'll find a marriage certificate filed this afternoon. Legal, binding, in the name of Vivienne Decker." He paused. "That's why we did this." "I know." She looked back over her shoulder at the empty road. "But the way he looked at me, he looks at everyone that way. It's his job. He's going to keep looking. Then we make sure that when he finds what he's looking for, it doesn't give him anything useful." Rafe kept his eyes forward. A married woman on her husband's ranch in Wyoming is not the person on that notice. Legally, she doesn't exist anymore. Vivienne wanted to believe him. She almost did. They rode hard, and the sun set ahead of them, and when they finally reached the ranch, the sky was the color of a bruise fading to gold. Rafe took the horse to the barn. Vivienne stood in the yard for a moment, looking at the house, which was exactly the same as it had always been and entirely different. She went inside. She made coffee that she didn't drink. She lit the lamps. She paced the small space until the restlessness of the day had nowhere left to go. When Rafe came in, his expression was closed off in a way she hadn't seen before, the flat, shuttered look of a man who has spent a long day doing things that cost him something. "Everything's checked," he said. "Property's secure. You should sleep inside tonight." She hadn't planned to say it, and she heard the way it landed between them and added quickly, "You shouldn't be out in the barn alone. If they come back, I'll take the floor. There's a couch. That's your house. And you're my wife, legally speaking." The word moved through him oddly, like a stone through water. "Wife gets the bed." She didn't argue. He disappeared into the barn to make a final check, and she climbed into the bed, which smelled of him. Leather and wood smoke, and the particular scent of a man who works outside in cold weather and lay staring at the ceiling while the night settled around the house. She was a married woman. The word felt strange. She had spent her whole life being told that marriage was the thing she was built for, the destination of all that expensive education and careful preparation. And here she was married, and it looked nothing like what she'd been prepared for, and everything like what she'd run away from home to find. Not a prison, an arrangement between two people who had chosen it clearly with open eyes and full knowledge of the cost. She could leave any time. He had said so. She believed him. She was still awake when he came in from the barn, settled on the couch near the fireplace with a blanket and the rifle within reach. And she listened to his breathing slow and even out, and she thought, this is what it looks like. Not romance? Not the story she'd been told about marriage. Two broken people protecting each other in the dark. She fell asleep thinking it might be enough. They woke to horses. The dawn was barely a gray suggestion in the eastern sky when the sound of multiple riders brought Vivienne upright from a sleep she hadn't known was that shallow. Rafe was already at the window, rifle in hand, his face tight. "How many?" she asked, crossing to the window. "6, maybe 7. He checked the load in the rifle. "Gage and Company." The man from Millhaven, Thomas Gage, she would learn, rode at the front. Beside him was a man in a dark suit who held himself with a particular uprightness of official authority. The others fanned out behind them, all armed, all moving with the practiced ease of men who do this for a living. "Rafe Bennett," Gage's voice carried cleanly in the still morning air. "This is Federal Marshal John Crawford. We have a warrant for the arrest of Vivienne Calloway on charges of theft." Rafe looked at Vivienne. She looked at the certificate folded inside her coat, which she'd slept with like a talisman. "Theft of what?" he called back. "A horse valued at $200, Gage said. "Property of Edmund Calloway, plus various jewelry and household items." Vivienne felt cold spread from her chest outward. Of course. Of course her father had thought of this. Turning her into a criminal made everything else so much simpler. "The warrant is legal," the marshal called. "You have 5 minutes to comply." Rafe looked at her. His eyes asked a question. She thought about it, ran through the options, the way she'd been running through options for weeks, calculating each path to its end. Fight, they'd be killed or arrested, and arrested meant federal custody, and eventually her father's lawyers, and eventually Harlan Voss. Run the same thing eventually, with more suffering along the way. "The marriage certificate," she said quietly. "Can they really undo it?" "With the right lawyers and the right judge, probably." His voice was flat. "Your father has both." "So it was for nothing." "Not for nothing." He said it with conviction. "It bought time. It proved you can make your own choices. And it gives us—" He stopped. "What?" He looked at the warrant, looked at the men outside, looked at her. "A story," he said, "if you're willing to tell it." 3 minutes. The marshal was counting. "Stay behind me," Rafe said. He opened the front door. "Don't." Vivienne put her hand on his arm. "I'll go first." "Vivienne, it's my story." She stepped out from behind him and walked to the edge of the porch. Gage's eyes found her immediately. His expression shifted, not triumph exactly, but the satisfied focus of a man who has been looking for something and found it. "Miss Calloway," he said, "your father has been very worried." "My father," she said in a voice designed to carry, "has been very inconvenienced. There's a difference." She looked past Gage to the marshal. "Marshal Crawford." The man on the dark horse inclined his head slightly. His eyes were level, unreadable. "That warrant is based on false premises," she said. "The horse cited as stolen was given to me by my mother before she died. I have documentation. The jewelry was hers, left to me in her will, and I have a copy of that too." She paused. "But more importantly, I'm not Vivienne Calloway anymore. I'm Vivienne Decker. I was married yesterday afternoon in Millhaven, Wyoming. The certificate is registered with the county court." Gage smiled. "Your father anticipated that possibility. He has lawyers already working on an annulment, grounds of coercion and mental incompetence. I coerced no one. And I am standing here making rational arguments while your employer is trying to use federal law to force a woman back to a man who intends to sell her to a judge who killed his last 2 wives." She met the marshal's eyes directly. "Which one of us sounds incompetent, Marshal?" The silence that followed had texture to it. She pushed through it. "Marshal Crawford," she kept her voice steady, factual, precise. "Judge Harlan Voss has buried 2 wives, Dorothea Voss and Marion Voss, both dead before 30, both with documented injuries that their attending physicians were paid to misattribute. I can name those physicians. I can name the man who paid them." She paused. "My father arranged my marriage to this man without my consent. When I refused, he threatened to have me drugged and delivered. When I left, he turned me into a criminal with a theft warrant." She spread her hands. "This is the case you've been sent to enforce." Crawford had not moved. His expression was the professional blank of a man who has learned not to let his face make decisions ahead of his mind. "Even if everything you're saying is true," he said carefully, "I have a legal warrant. I have orders. I cannot simply—" "You can," she said. "You're a federal marshal. You have discretion. You can file a report that says you lost my trail. You can decide that the resources required to pursue this case are better spent on matters that don't amount to enforcing domestic tyranny with federal authority." She looked at him steadily. "Or you can bring me back to Montana and watch what happens when I tell my story in court. Under oath, in public, in an election year with Voss's judicial appointment coming up for review." Another silence. Behind Crawford, one of his men shifted in the saddle. Another cleared his throat. Crawford folded the warrant slowly, once, twice, tucked it into his coat. "Gage," he said. "Marshal, we're done here." Gage stared at him. "You can't be serious." "I am entirely serious." Crawford looked at Vivienne. "Mrs. Decker." He touched his hat. "I'd suggest you and your husband move west sooner rather than later. Wyoming may have a longer memory than I can manage." "I understand." She held his gaze. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. Just disappear." He turned his horse. The other men followed. Gage sat for a moment longer looking at Vivienne with an expression that was half professional frustration and half something more complicated. "Your father won't give up," he said. "I know." She held his gaze. "Neither will I." He turned and rode after the marshal. The dust settled. The sound of hooves faded. And then it was just the two of them standing in the quiet ranch yard in the Wyoming morning and the distant mountains wearing their first thin crown of early snow. Rafe let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for some time. That, he said, was insane. That was necessary. She turned to look at him. Her hands were shaking now that the adrenaline had nothing left to burn. "Is it over?" "Crawford bought us time. Your father still has lawyers. Voss still has influence. Engage. We'll try again." "Yes." He looked at her. "Which means we have a limited window to do what Crawford suggested. Move. Get further west than this warrant can conveniently reach." "We," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "Yes. You don't have to." "I know." He turned back to the house. "But I'm going to. Now let's go inside and figure out how." Vivienne stood in the yard a moment longer, feeling the shaking in her hands slowly subside. She looked at the barn, the house, the corral where the horses moved in their patient circles. She looked at the mountains. Then she went inside. They had work to do. They had 2 days before Gage came back. Vivienne spent those days preparing with the focused efficiency she had developed over weeks of hard work, choosing what to take, what to leave, calculating weights and distances and probabilities. The way her father had taught her to calculate social advantages, the same calculus turned to entirely different purposes. Rafe worked alongside her mostly in silence, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not closed, not calculated, something more like two people operating in the same rhythm, which was its own form of communication. The night before they intended to leave, they sat by the fire with the preparations mostly done, and the ranch around them quiet in the particular way places get quiet when they know they're being left. "Tell me," Vivienne said. He looked at her. "You said you'd tell me everything. After dark." She held his gaze. "It's after dark." He was quiet for a long moment. She watched him decide something. She could see it in the line of his shoulders, the careful settling of it. He reached under the seat of his chair and produced a bottle of whiskey she hadn't known was there. Poured 2 glasses, set one in front of her. "You're going to want that," he said. She drank. The burn of it steadied something. "My name isn't Rafe Decker," he said. "It's Rafe Callister. I was born in Texas. My father ran a cattle operation bigger than most counties." He turned the glass in his hands, watching the firelight move in it. "I was supposed to take it over. Learn the business, marry appropriately, build the empire further. What happened? I fell in love with the wrong woman." His voice didn't change, but something in the room did. Her name was Alice. She worked in a dress shop in town. She was smart and quick-witted, and she had opinions about everything and wasn't afraid to say them. He paused. "My father hated her on sight, said she was beneath us, common, unsuitable. But you married her anyway." "Yes." Something flickered in his face, old and tender and painful, the look of a man visiting a wound that is healed wrong. "Small ceremony, nobody from my family. We were happy, genuinely happy, in a way I'm not sure I'd ever been before. We had almost nothing, but it was ours." "And your father?" "My father bought this building her shop was in, evicted her employer, made sure no one in town would hire her after that." His jaw tightened. "When that didn't work, he cut me off entirely. Told me I could come home when I'd rid myself of the embarrassment." "You didn't?" "No." Flat and final. "We moved to a different town. I took what work I could. It was hard, genuinely hard, not ranch hand hard, but hungry and winter hard. But Alice never complained. She just kept saying we'd make our own way." He looked at the fire. "We'd been in that town about 3 months when she got sick. Cough first, then fever, then she couldn't get out of bed." Vivienne felt cold before he finished. "I tried every doctor, every remedy. They all wanted money I didn't have because my father had seen to it that no bank in the territory would extend me credit." He stopped, started again. She died on a Thursday in a rented room. The doctor told me afterward if she'd gotten treatment 2 weeks earlier, she'd likely have lived. I'm so sorry, Vivienne said softly. Don't. His voice was even. I buried her. Then I went home. Something changed in his face. I walked into my father's study and I told him what he'd done. Told him he'd killed her as surely as if he'd put a gun to her head. He was quiet. You want to know what he said? She waited. He said, good. Now you can marry someone appropriate and we can move forward. Vivienne said nothing. There was nothing to say. I hit him, Rafe said. Broke his jaw. His men pulled me off before I did worse. They threw me out and told me if I came back, I'd be arrested for assault. He looked at the fire. So I drifted for a while, drinking, fighting, trying to outrun what I'd lost. Eventually it ended up in Wyoming, met a man selling this ranch, bought it with the last of whatever money I'd managed to scrape together. Changed my name. Started over. A pause. 5 years of telling myself I'd moved on. 5 years of solitude and work and pretending that was a life instead of just a very long punishment. And then I showed up, Vivienne said. And then you showed up. Something shifted in his expression. Someone else running from powerful men who thought they owned her. Someone else trapped by family and money and circumstances she hadn't chosen. He looked at her steadily. I couldn't save Alice. But maybe I could. He stopped. Maybe you could save me, she said. Balance some kind of account. Maybe. He looked away. Or maybe I was just tired of being alone. Vivienne sat with that. She could hear the honesty in it, the way people sound when they're saying the true thing after a long time of saying the necessary thing. My father is probably still looking for you, she said. Not just for me. If those investigators dig deep enough, they might connect Rafe Decker to Rafe Callister. He nodded. I know. Your father and mine, they're the same kind of man. The same equation. Control matters more than love. Image matters more than truth. His hands curled into fists on his knees, which means we're both targets. Which means this is my fault. No. Sharp and clear. This is their fault. All of it. He met her eyes. People like your father don't build empires. They build prisons and call them empires, and then they're surprised when the people inside them want out. He paused. I should have gone further west when I came here. I got tired. This place felt like enough. It was enough, she said, for a while. For a while, they sat in silence for a moment, and the fire cracked and shifted, and outside the wind moved over the ranch in slow sweeps. I'm not going to apologize, Vivienne said finally, for showing up here. You'd have done the same thing. Probably. And I'm not going to apologize for what comes next, whatever it is. She looked at him steadily. But I want you to understand that you didn't just marry a problem I brought to your door. You married someone who intends to be worth the trouble. He looked at her for a long moment. I know, he said. That was all. But it was enough. They left before dawn. The ranch disappeared behind them in the dark, and Vivienne did not look back. She had looked back once already, and it hadn't helped, and she had learned by now that the things you leave behind don't get smaller because you keep checking. Rafe knew the territory the way you know a thing you've crossed in desperation and then crossed again in better shape. He chose paths that weren't paths found water, where the landscape didn't advertise it, kept them in valleys and creek beds, where they were less visible from the ridgelines. You've been this way before, Vivienne said, several times. When you first came out here, and after, when I needed to think. He looked at the horizon. Mountains have a way of sorting things out. They traveled for 2 days camping cold, eating from the supplies they'd packed. The landscape changed around them, flatter Wyoming giving way to something more complex, the land rising and rolling in ways that promised altitude ahead. The mountains were no longer a distant idea, but an actual presence, looming and snow-capped and indifferent to human problems, which Vivienne found oddly comforting. On the third night, they heard dogs. The sound came from the southeast, carried on the wind in intermittent bursts, the deep, purposeful baying of tracking hounds working a trail. Rafe went very still. Trackers, he said. Can we outrun them? No, dogs don't tire the same way horses do, and they don't lose a scent unless we give them a reason to. He was already calculating, scanning the terrain. There's a river about 2 miles north, fast-running, cold. If we can reach it, it'll break the trail. How bad is it going to be? He looked at her with an honesty she appreciated. Bad, fast current cold water late in the season, but manageable if we don't fight it. Then let's go. They rode north, and the sound of the dogs grew closer, and Vivienne focused on the horse beneath her and the man riding ahead of her and the specific immediate problem of the next 2 miles because that was all there was room for. The river appeared in the darkness, a black moving sound, before it was a visible thing cutting through the landscape with the indifference of water that has been doing exactly this for 1,000 years. Rafe didn't pause at the bank. He drove his horse straight in. Vivienne followed. The cold hit her like a wall, immediate, shocking, the kind of cold that bypasses thought and hits something more fundamental. The current was strong, pulling sideways and down, and she felt her horse stagger with the effort of holding its footing. She leaned forward, kept her weight centered, felt the animal stabilize beneath her. "Let the river carry you," Rafe called over the roar of it. "Don't fight it. Let it take you downstream, and then work back to the bank." She let go, not of the horse, not of the reins, but of the part of her that wanted to fight every force that threatened to take her somewhere she hadn't chosen. She let the river do what rivers do, and her horse moved with it, and Rafe's horse moved beside her, and they tumbled downstream in the dark for what felt like forever. When he finally signaled toward the bank, she could barely feel her arms. They dragged themselves onto the far side and collapsed against the bank. The horses blowing hard, Vivienne shaking so violently she couldn't fully control her hands. The sound of the dogs had fragmented. She could hear them on the far bank milling in confusion, the trail broken. "That'll slow them," Rafe said through chattering teeth. "It won't stop them forever." "How long?" "Hours. Maybe until dawn, if they have to go looking for a ford." He looked at her. His face was wet, his hair plastered flat. He looked entirely human and entirely exhausted. "Are you all right?" "Cold, scared, alive." She tried to make her hands work. "That's what matters." "That's what matters," he agreed. They couldn't risk a fire. They pulled the saddle blankets out of the soaked packs miraculously. One was less wet than the others and huddled together against the bank using the horse's warmth and each other's. It was the closest they had been since the marriage ceremony, and Vivienne was too cold to care about what it meant. "This wasn't what I imagined married life would look like," she said. The words came out half numb from the cold. Rafe's laugh was weak but genuine. "Me neither. What did you imagine with Alice?" He was quiet for a moment. "A house, nothing fancy but ours. A garden, maybe. She wanted to grow things, said she'd grown up in a city and never had dirt under her fingernails, and it was the thing she wanted most." He paused. "We'd been married 6 months when she got sick. We hadn't even had time to want things yet. We were still just figuring out how to be together. I'm sorry you didn't get more time. I think about her every day, but differently now." He shifted slightly, and she felt the movement through the shared blanket. "For a long time, it was only grief, only the accounting of what I'd lost. But lately," he started again. "I've been thinking about what she'd say if she could see me right now." "What would she say?" He was quiet for a moment. "She'd say I was an idiot for marrying someone I barely knew and getting myself hunted by federal marshals." A pause. "But she'd also say it was the right thing to do. She always believed in helping people who needed it, even when it cost you something." He looked at Vivienne in the darkness. "She was better than I deserved." "I don't believe that. You didn't know me then. I know you now." Vivienne looked at him steadily. "And I think you're exactly as good as someone who's been through what you've been through and hasn't let it make you cruel." She paused, "Which is better than most people manage." He looked at her with something in his expression that she had no name for yet. "You're different than I expected," he said. "You keep saying that because it keeps being true." He turned back to the dark water. "You're stronger than I thought. You've been through hell, and you're still thinking clearly, still fighting." A pause. "Most people after everything you've been through would have given up somewhere around the Sheriff-in crossroads." "I don't know how to give up," she said. "My father made sure of that. He trained me to be decorative but resilient. I think he forgot that resilience doesn't care which direction you point it." His mistake, our advantage. She felt a thin, exhausted thread of something like humor. At least something useful came out of all those years. They lapsed into quiet, and the river moved beside them, and the night pressed close with all its sounds, some pursuit, some just wilderness, and Vivienne drifted in and out of something that wasn't quite sleep. She woke to Rafe's hand on her shoulder, gentle and urgent. "We need to move." Dawn was a rumor in the eastern sky. She was stiff from cold and position, and getting up was an act of pure will, but she did it. They rode on. The mountains grew closer. The terrain grew rougher. On the third day after the river crossing, they found the mining camp. It appeared like something the mountain had tried to grow, and given up on a collection of rotting structures clinging to the slope, the remnants of someone's ambition from 15 or 20 years ago, mostly unmaintained. Rafe checked it carefully before they approached, looking for signs of recent occupation. There were none. "We'll rest here," he said, "longer than one night if we need to." The most intact building had been a bunkhouse once. It still had walls and most of a roof and a cast iron stove that Rafe declared functional after a close inspection and a carefully placed fire that put out minimal smoke. Vivienne gathered what wood she could find, and they established a camp that was rudimentary but defensible. "What do we do now?" she asked. "We wait." He was sorting through their remaining supplies with methodical care. "See if they found our trail, or if the river worked. If we're clear, we resupply as much as possible, and then continue west." He looked up. "There are settlements in California that don't ask questions, places that have seen enough different kinds of people that one more couple with a fresh start doesn't raise eyebrows. And if they found us," he met her eyes, "then we make a stand." She thought about that. She thought about what standing felt like the porch of the ranch house. Crawford's level gaze, the warrant being folded and put away. She thought about what running felt like, weeks of it, the constant calculation, the bone-deep exhaustion of never being able to stop thinking. "I'm tired," she said. "Not a complaint, just a fact offered plainly." "I know. Not of running exactly, of never being able to stop." She looked at him. "You said you were tired of running that night in the barn." "Yes." "Did you mean it? Really mean it?" He set down the food he'd been sorting. "Yes." "Then I want to know what it looks like if we stop. Not if we're caught, if we choose. What does standing look like?" "It looks like whatever comes next," he said. "Whatever they send, we face it. With the truth if we can, with other means if we have to." He looked at her with the directness that was she had learned his version of emotional honesty. "But I'm not running indefinitely, and I'm not running away from you." She heard the emphasis on the last word. "What do you mean?" He was quiet for a moment. "I mean that somewhere between the barn and the bunkhouse and the river and this rotting mountain camp," he said, "I stopped thinking of this as me helping you escape your situation and started thinking of it as us, our situation." He paused. "And I don't know exactly when that happened, but it did, and I think you should know." Vivienne looked at him. The fire cracked. The mountain wind moved through the gaps in the old wood. "I know," she said. He looked at her. "I've known for a while," she said. "I just didn't know what to do with it." She looked at her hands, which had been through so much in the past months that they barely resembled the hands she'd started with. "My whole life I was told that marriage was the goal, the end point, the thing I was building toward. And I watched my mother disappear into it and swore I would never." She stopped. "I was so afraid of what love costs that I never let myself think about what it gives." "What does it give?" he asked. She thought about it, genuinely thought rather than reaching for the first available answer. "Someone to face things with," she said finally. "Someone who knows the whole truth and hasn't used it to diminish you." She met his eyes. "Someone who ran with you when they didn't have to." He reached across the space between them and covered her hand with his. The contact was simple and complete. "We're not safe yet," he said. "I know, but we're going to be." Outside in the mountain dark, something moved through the trees. They both heard it, both stilled, both waited. It was just wind, just an old dead branch giving way. They looked at each other, and the tension released, and something about that shared moment, that shared vigilance, that shared return to steady felt more like marriage than the paper in her coat ever had. "California," she said. "California," he agreed. The fire burned low, and they sat beside it, and the mountain held them in its cold, indifferent hands, and it was, Vivienne thought, almost enough. The pass through the mountains nearly killed them twice. The first time was a narrow ledge above a ravine that hadn't shown itself until they were already committed to it, 30 feet of slick rock, where one of the horses slipped and scrabbled, and Vivienne held her breath and her reins and didn't move until the animal found its footing. The second time was weather a fast-moving early storm that came down off the peaks with no warning and turned the path ahead into white confusion. They sheltered in a shallow overhang for 6 hours close together under every blanket they had, while the snow said everything it had to say and then moved on. "Still think this was worth it?" Rafe asked somewhere in hour 4, his voice dry. "Ask me when we're on the other side." But they kept moving, and the mountain eventually let them through. On the 13th day of travel, they crested the final pass and stopped. Below them, California spread out in rolling golden hills and green valleys, softer than anything they'd seen in weeks, the light moving across it in long, warm sweeps. After the hard angles of Wyoming and the severity of the mountains, it looked almost gentle. "We made it," Vivienne said. Her voice came out strange, too small for what she felt. "First part," Rafe said. But his face had done something, relaxed slightly around the eyes, in the set of his jaw, the tension of weeks releasing incrementally. They descended. The town of Redwood Creek sat in a valley along a small river that would indeed flood every spring, as Rafe predicted from the elevated watermark on the stone buildings. It was quiet, isolated, the kind of place that had been established by people who wanted to be left alone and had maintained that preference. A boarding house, a general store, a blacksmith, a mill, a small school. The population was perhaps 300, drawn from enough different backgrounds that strangers with fresh names didn't attract the kind of attention that made life difficult. The boarding house was run by a woman named Mrs. Lena Park, who was perhaps 60, with sharp eyes, a direct manner, and the air of someone who had seen enough of the world to be unsurprisable and had chosen warmth anyway. She looked them over when they arrived, dusty, road-worn, with the particular combination of exhaustion and alertness that long travel produces, and showed them to a room with a narrow window that looked out over the valley. "You two running from something?" she asked, not unkindly. "Running towards something," Vivienne said. It had been her answer for months, and she'd meant it more or less as a hope. Standing in this quiet valley room, that it started to feel like a fact. Mrs. Park looked at her for a moment. "Good answer," she said, and left them to it. They established themselves in Redwood Creek the way you establish anything worth having, slowly through repeated acts of ordinary commitment. Rafe found work at the lumber mill within the first week, the kind of work that suited a man who was good with his hands and didn't need much conversation. The pay was modest but honest, and within a month, the foreman had asked him to supervise a crew of 3, which Rafe did with the same quiet competence he applied to everything. Vivienne went to the hotel 2 days after they arrived and asked for work. The manager, a tired, perpetually understaffed man named Mr. Forsyth, hired her on the spot to help with rooms and kitchen, and discovered within 2 weeks that she could also keep the ledgers with a clarity and precision that he had never managed himself. "Where'd you learn accounting?" he asked. "My father," she said. "He was very thorough about teaching me the value of things." She kept the irony out of her voice. I paid attention. She kept their new name, Vivienne Decker. She used it without hesitation. And after a few months, almost without awareness, it had settled into her the way new habits settle gradually and then all at once. They were careful. No unnecessary trips to Cheyenne or Sacramento. No written correspondence that could create a paper trail. They kept their past vague in the way of people who have weathered things they don't intend to discuss and have learned that most people, if you give them nothing to grab onto, won't reach. But they were not, Vivienne began to realize, invisible. They were known, in the specific, limited, valuable way of a small community that has decided you belong. Mrs. Park took to them with an affection that was practical rather than sentimental. "You remind me of my late husband and I," she said one evening over tea in the boarding house parlor, the fire making the small room warm against the cooling autumn air outside. "When we were young, working hard, trying to build something when everyone around us was suggesting we shouldn't bother." "Why were they suggesting that?" Vivienne asked. Mrs. Park smiled. It was the smile of a woman who has been asked this question and found the asking worthwhile. "He was a Chinese immigrant. I was an Irish girl from Boston. We were not, according to everyone who had an opinion, suitable for each other." She poured more tea. "We were married 41 years. "What was the secret?" Rafe asked. "No secret." She set the teapot down. "Stubbornness, and the daily decision to choose each other even on the days when it was inconvenient, especially then." She looked at them with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who has watched a great many marriages from a boarding house parlor. Also honesty, even when it hurt, especially then. After she left, Vivienne and Rafe sat with their tea and the weight of that. "Are we honest?" she asked finally. "Really honest?" He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we're living as husband and wife. We've told each other the important truths, but there's still," she set down her cup, "there's still a distance. We're both still being careful." He was quiet for a moment. "What do you want us to be?" he asked. "I asked you first," she said and smiled slightly. He didn't smile back, but something in his face softened. "I want it to be real, not just an arrangement. I want—" He stopped, started again. "I want to come home and have it mean something. I want to build something here that we both intend to stay in." He looked at his hands. "I want to stop being afraid you'll leave as soon as you feel safe enough." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and exposed. "I'm afraid too," Vivienne said. that you're only here because of guilt, that I'm standing in for something you lost, that you'll realize eventually that I'm not what you were trying to save. And stop. His voice was gentle but firm. You're not Alice. You're nothing like her, and I don't mean that as a diminishment of either of you. She was gentle and forgiving, and she made peace with things easily. He looked at her. Your iron and fire and pure stubborn refusal to bend. You stood up to federal marshals. You bet your life on one speech to a man who had every legal reason to ignore you. He paused. I didn't marry you to save you. I married you because I couldn't think of a reason not to, and I've been finding more reasons since. Vivienne felt tears in her eyes, not sad tears, but the kind that come when something you've been afraid to want turns out to be right there. I'm falling in love with you, she said. And I know that's terrifying to say, but you said we should be honest. I'm falling in love with you too. No hesitation. And it scares the hell out of me because the last time I loved someone, she died and it was my fault. It wasn't your fault. I know that now. It didn't then. He met her eyes. What I know now is that the answer to losing someone isn't to stop caring about people. He stopped, found the right words. It's to be more careful, more honest, more present. He reached across and took her hand, the same gesture he'd made in the mining camp, simple and sure. You keep your fire, keep your independence. Just let me stand beside it instead of in front of it. That's not bad, she said, for a lumber mill worker. I have my moments. That night, for the first time, they chose each other without the logic of strategy or survival pressing on them from behind. Not because they had to, because they wanted to. It was, Vivienne thought, an enormous difference. Spring came in stages, cautious and then sudden, the valley going from brown to green in a span of weeks that felt like a miracle every time. They moved out of the boarding house in March. Rafe had spent the winter saving and had supplemented his earnings with furniture he built in the evenings. A chair, a table, a set of shelves for Mrs. Park's parlor that she declared the nicest thing she'd owned in 20 years. Word spread the way things spread in small communities, and by February, he had a small sideline business producing cabinets and dressers and beds for families in the valley who were building lives and needed things built to put in them. The land they rented was modest 5 acres on the eastern edge of the valley, a cabin that needed work, a barn that needed more. Rafe rebuilt the worst of it with help from men at the mill who came on weekends and worked for a shared meal, and the understanding that the favor would be returned. Vivienne planted a garden. She did it with the particular intensity of a person who has spent a long time being denied the right to put down roots, who finally has ground to plant in, and intends to make the most of it. She grew everything she could: vegetables, herbs, flowers that had no practical purpose, except to be beautiful because she had spent enough time in places that were purely practical and had decided that beauty was not a luxury but a form of resistance. She bought 4 chickens. She still didn't like them. She tended them anyway with the resigned competence of a person who has accepted that some things you do not have to love in order to value. They bought 2 horses, good ones, with the money from a run of furniture commissions that exceeded what Rafe had expected. And one evening in May, 6 months after they'd arrived in California, a young man in a postal uniform knocked on their cabin door. Vivienne's heart stopped. Rafe was behind her, and she felt him still, the old vigilance, immediate and total. "Letter for Mrs. Vivienne Decker," the postal worker said. "Come a long way." She signed for it, closed the door, stood very still for a moment looking at it. The handwriting on the envelope was feminine. The return address was Montana. Her hands shook as she opened it. The letter was from Clara Watts. She read it once quickly, then again slowly. Then she handed it to Rafe without a word and watched his face as he read it. The essential facts were these: Judge Harlan Voss had been arrested 4 months ago. One of his household servants, a woman who had worked there during his first marriage, had come forward with evidence that had been kept hidden for years. Medical reports, testimony from 2 physicians who had been paid for silence and had finally decided that payment wasn't worth what they'd been carrying. The evidence had destroyed Voss publicly and catastrophically. And Vivienne Calloway, so publicly and prominently associated with the planned match, had been destroyed alongside him. The scandal had cost him his seat on the territorial council, his business partnerships, his carefully constructed reputation. People had started asking questions about how he ran his household, about what had happened to Vivienne's mother in those years before she died. Questions he couldn't answer cleanly. He was not, Clara wrote, a powerful man anymore. He was just an old man who had lost everything because He had tried to control what didn't belong to him. I thought you should know you're free. Clara's letter ended. Really free. I hope you found what you were looking for. You deserved it. Rafe set the letter on the table. Vivienne stood very still. It's over, she said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, too thin, not quite containing what she felt. It's over. He can't touch me now. She picked up the letter again as though rereading it would make it more real. Either of them. You were always free, Rafe said quietly. You freed yourself. This just means you don't have to keep hiding the fact. She looked at him. I don't want to go back, she said. I know that might seem, it doesn't seem anything. He moved to her, stood close. This is home. She looked around the cabin. The table he'd built, the shelves full of things they'd collected and made, and been given the window that looked out over her garden with the mountains visible beyond it. Yes, she said, it is. He pulled her close and she let herself lean into him. Really lean, not the careful proximity they'd maintained for months in bunkhouses and mining camps and boarding house rooms, but the full weight of it, the actual physical fact of relying on another person. She hadn't done that in a long time. It felt like putting something down. The years that followed built themselves the way all good things build, slowly through the accumulation of small choices and ordinary days and the occasional extraordinary moment that reframes everything before and after it. Rafe's workshop expanded from a corner of the barn to a proper building. His furniture found its way into houses throughout the valley and then into the next valley over. And then a craftsman in Sacramento heard about his work and came to look at it and left with a contract for 6 dining sets. He hired a young man named Eli to help, and then a second, and the business that had started as a way to occupy evenings became the center of his working life. Vivienne had stopped keeping the hotel's books after she had their first child. She hadn't planned to stop. She had planned to continue working because work was part of who she was, and she had no intention of allowing motherhood to reduce her the way it had reduced her mother to a life lived entirely for other people's purposes. And she had continued, but gradually what she found herself doing with her time had shifted. She wrote letters. The first one had been to a woman she'd heard about from Mrs. Park, a rancher's wife, in the next county, trapped in a situation that Mrs. Park described in careful oblique terms that Vivienne had no trouble decoding. She wrote the woman a letter that said, essentially, I was where you are. Here is what I know. Here is what is possible. Here is that there are people who will help you. The woman had written back. And then gradually, through a network that built itself through word of mouth and shared desperation, and the simple fact that Vivienne answered every letter that found her there, were more women. Some in California, some still in the territories planning, waiting, gathering courage for the run they hadn't made yet. Some who had already run and needed to know they weren't alone. She built a room for it. Rafe suggested it one autumn evening, sitting on the porch watching their 2 children, a boy named James and a girl named Mila, both dark-haired, both stubborn, in ways that made their parents look at each other sideways, play in the last of the daylight. You're always writing at the kitchen table, he said. You should have a proper space. She looked at him. You'd be all right with that, me spending time on it that much time, instead of Vivienne. He looked at her with the steady patience that was she had learned one of his most fundamental characteristics. I married the woman who stared down a federal marshal with nothing but the truth in her own voice. I am not going to ask that woman to spend her days exclusively doing laundry. She laughed, and it was a full laugh, unguarded, the kind she'd learned she could have in this life. You might regret saying that when James takes apart the chicken coop again, she said. He gets that from you. He gets it from both of us. Their daughter ran up, demanding to be lifted, and Rafe swung her up with the ease of someone who has done this 10,000 times and will do it 10,000 more. James was attempting with great seriousness to reason with one of the chickens, a negotiation that was not going well, but that he pursued with the kind of stubborn optimism that Vivienne recognized as her own. She had built this, all of it, from the ground up, from nothing, from a locked bedroom in a Montana mansion and a pearl necklace pressed into a housemaid's shaking hands, in 20 miles of darkness on a stolen horse. She thought about Clara, who had kept her promise and paid for it with her position, and had landed, according to her letters, in a much better house with a much kinder employer and a young man she intended to marry in the spring. She thought about Marshall Crawford, who had folded a warrant and said, just disappear, and who she suspected had known exactly what he was doing. She thought about her father alone in a house that had become small, without the power that had once inflated it. She thought about Harlan Voss facing the weight of what he'd done, finally made visible, finally undeniable. And she thought about Alice Callister, dead at 24. in a rented room who had wanted to grow things and had instead become the grief that eventually grew into something good. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Any of it?" Rafe was quiet for a long moment, the particular quiet of honest consideration, not evasion. "I regret Alice," he said. "I'll always regret that she didn't get more time, that she died, because powerful men cared more about appearances than about people." He watched James negotiate unsuccessfully with the chicken. "But I don't regret what came after. I don't regret running. I don't regret finding you. Or marrying me under duress in a Wyoming county office with a borrowed pen. Best decision I ever made under duress." He looked at her sidelong. "You..." She thought about it honestly, the way she'd learned to think about things, not rushing to the comfortable answer, but actually checking. "I regret the years I spent afraid," she said. "I regret that it took being driven out to understand what I was capable of. But no." She looked at the valley, the mountains, the children, the husband, the life. "No, not a single step of the getting here." The sun finished setting, painting everything in the warm extravagance of a California autumn evening, and James gave up on the chicken and ran in with his news of failure, and Mila demanded to be let down so she could run too, and Rafe and Vivienne watched their children move through the golden light of the life they'd built. It was not the life Vivienne Calloway had been prepared for. It was not the life Rafe Callister had expected to live. But it was theirs, earned through stubbornness and running and the repeated daily choice to face the next thing instead of surrendering to it. Built from nothing but the understanding that some things are worth fighting for, even when the fighting costs you everything you thought you needed. The past was done. The future was unwritten. And the present, this evening, this light, these children, this man was more than enough. Vivienne and Decker stepped off the porch, walked out into the garden she had grown from ground that hadn't expected it, and let herself feel the full weight of being exactly where she had chosen to be. Free, chosen home.